So, welcome everybody to our second Seleukid Wednesday. I am glad that so many of you have made it, and I'm sure we will be joined from more colleagues from around the northern hemisphere, at least. So that was a very good turnout in the registration process, reaching as far as China this time.
Yeah.
Well, I'm welcoming you together with my co-host Ben Scolnic, we would like to introduce our speaker today and our respondent. So Dr. Richard Wenghofer will be speaking today. He gained his PhD at York University in Toronto, and he is currently assistant professor and chair of classical studies at the University of Nipissing in North Bay, Ontario. His interests range from ethnic constructs, ancient history in the Near and Middle East, and dynastic history of the Hellenistic world. He has been a loyal contributor to the Seleukid study group as of the third study day, which took place in Bordeaux in 2012. And he also was our local organizer for Seleukid Study Day 6 in North Bay in 2017. He has published various articles, especially on the Bactrian dynasty, but also on the nature of Seleukid kingship. And this broad field is actually also the background to his current presentation and a series of case studies he's producing on the specific theme of loyalty to and legitimacy to a certain Hellenistic royal family, specifically the Seleukid kings. And it's lovely in our group, which is a very open group, that we have a lot of dissent. That is good for learning. So there is a lot of lively but always friendly discussion and dispute. Over the last years, you may have seen that in the field of Hellenistic and Seleukid studies, a lot of scholarship has been presented that analyzes strategies of legitimization and also ideological communication between a royal court and subjects and elites and so on. Richard has felt that something is missing in the picture. The more honest and undistorted view of the common people. So his presentation will try to shed some light and potentially correct or at least complement the current view that we have on the topic. Before I leave the floor to him, I'd like to also introduce the respondent to this presentation. This will be by Dr. Kyle Erickson, who gained his PhD at the University of Exeter. He has served for several years as the head of classical studies at the University Trinity St. David in Lampeter, Wales, and has now, or last year, I think, moved up to the director of academic experience. And so he's well known to Seleukid scholars because he has already published a couple of very important books, including his PhD, which was reworked as a monograph on the early Seleukids, their gods and their coins, published in 2019. Besides, he edited or co-edited 3 volumes on Hellenistic, largely Seleukid history. Most importantly, the Bordeaux Conference Proceedings, which is one of the most important contributions altogether on 3rd century Seleukid history. So I'm very happy that Kai did not hesitate to be available for us, for Richard, with his comments right after the presentation. The presentation is going to talk around 35 minutes. We will not count the minutes. This will then be followed by some comments by Kaya. And then Ben will take over and moderate the discussion and will give instructions for how you can then actively participate. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining. Thanks, Richard, for preparing this presentation on quite a short notice, and we are all keen on learning from you.
Thank you very much, Altay. I'm just going to share my screen here and pull up my slides. Let's see. For some reason, this is not.
It's coming.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay. Good. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Yes. Good, good, good. Alrighty. Well, welcome all, and thank you, Altay and Ben, for putting this series together and for allowing us all to stay connected and engaged in Seleukid history during these rather trying times. I appreciate the opportunity to address all of you today, and I hope that my talk will afterwards generate some fruitful discussion and allow us to think about some new ways forward on the question of Seleukid legitimacy. I appreciate, I will begin, however, before I begin, I should say, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the territory of Nipissing First Nation, the territory of the Anishinaabe, with lands protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. And as a settler here, I'm grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands with all of our family, friends, and relations. So to begin. Seleukid kings, like other Hellenistic monarchs, built their kingdoms first and foremost on war and violence. However, because a superior ability to wield violence alone is insufficient for legitimizing royal authority, Seleukid kings, perforce, negotiated their loyalty or their royal status, rather, with a myriad polities over whom they ruled. Seleukid kings would often, for example, grant local autonomy and other benefactions to local communities in exchange for acknowledgement of royal authority, which typically included expectations of political loyalty and the right to exploit physical and human capital locally. Seleukid kings thus developed a range of sophisticated strategies, from the deployment of visual imagery on coins, for example, court ceremonial, acts of civic euergetism, dynastic marriages, religious syncretism, to name but a few, to not only construct the image of Seleukid kingship itself, but to create a local consensus for Seleukid claims surrounding legitimate exercise of royal authority. The conventional wisdom generally follows that of John Ma, who observed that as cities, for example, proffered various and sundry honors to kings in thanks for royal benefactions, and as kings responded with approval and grace, the king's real source of power, his superior ability to wield violence, was obfuscated, and a space for the exercise of legitimate royal power was thus constructed. Beyond the Greek polis, of course, the construction of legitimate political authority would take different shapes, although the process of legitimizing royal authority would essentially be the same. By participating in the various rhetorical strategies Seleukid kings developed to legitimize their royal authority in their unique local contexts, putatively Seleukid polities helped construct a consensus around the legitimacy of royal authority. The question that I would like to address today, however, is a rather straightforward one. Did any of it actually work? Answering this question, however, raises certain methodological problems. The sources that we generally employ as evidence for how Seleukid kings constructed a popular consensus surrounding the legitimacy of their royal authority tells us next to nothing about how effective those strategies actually were. I will demonstrate this with a simple anecdote. In his Life of Demetrius, Plutarch notes that after Antigonus' defeat at Ipsus, his son, Demetrius Poliorcetes, headed for Athens in order to arrange for more troops and ships. He could be forgiven for expecting to receive them, since not 5 years earlier, both men had been offered crowns, titles, and sundry other honors in an exuberant display of affection from the demos. We can imagine his surprise then when, before arriving in Athens, an Athenian embassy intercepted him and told him that no king was in fact welcome in Athens. Plutarch then goes on to add the following observation. It rather looks as though the excessive awarding of honors by the masses is no true measure of their loyalty towards kings and dynasts. Such honors are good only if they are freely given. But fear, for honors may be awarded out of fear as much as affection, robs them of their value. Hence, sensible men consider what they have actually achieved and accomplished rather than the statues and portraits and deifications they have been awarded. And even then, either trust them as genuine honors or mistrust them as having been conferred by people who felt compelled to do so. After all, it is not uncommon for people of a city, even while they are conferring honors, to hate the recipients for accepting them immodestly and arrogantly, even from people who do not really want to confer them. Plutarch's remarks raise some significant problems. First, civic honors to kings could be disingenuous, masking deep hostility. Second, kings and dynasts often extorted such disingenuous displays of affection through fear and intimidation. When it comes to civic decrees, at least, honoring kings for their various acts of ergotism, we are thus effectively in a hall of mirrors. The king's interlocutors, out of fear born of the discrepancy in power between king and city, often merely reflected the king's own carefully constructed image back to him, telling us very little about how they really viewed that image. My objective today is to try to look past images of royal self-representation and its reflection in official public discourse toward the reactions and behaviors of what we might call the non-elite denizens of Seleukid-controlled territory, upon whose exploitation Seleukid power ultimately rested. I hope to demonstrate two things. First, that the relative quiescence of subject populations tells us very little about how those populations regarded Seleukid claims to legitimate royal authority. And second, that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that many non-elite peoples, by which I mean the hoi polloi of Seleukid settlements, including the rank-and-file soldiery, were largely indifferent to Seleukid claims to royal legitimacy and might even show a marked preference to be rid of it. At least from time to time. I will begin with a notice from Memnon on the immediate aftermath of Seleucus I's victory over Lysimachus at Corupedion. Memnon notes that after his victory, Seleucus sent Aphrodisias to administer the cities of Phrygia and the upper parts of Pontus. He carried out his business, and on his return, he praised the other cities, but accused the Heracleans of being hostile towards Seleucus. Irritated by this, Seleucus used threats to disparage and to scare the envoys who came to meet him. This anecdote and the previous passage from Plutarch together provide the lens through which I will try to interpret the admittedly rather impressionistic evidence that I will present today. There are two important things to note here. The first is that the Heracleans did not wish to submit to Seleucus, and the second is that Seleucus attempted to intimidate them into doing precisely that. In Heraclea, then, fear and loathing converged to shape the interaction between king and city. Now, Seleucus moved rather quickly to swallow up Lysimachus's territory in Asia Minor, Thrace, and Macedonia, and as he did so, he nursed a viper in his own court in the person of Ptolemy Caraunus. Ptolemy, as we know, assassinated Seleucus in 281 and proclaimed himself king in the newly acquired European territories. Antiochus I, whom Seleucus already named a joint king, and his successor was solidly ensconced in Babylon. But my question is, how did Caraunus get away with this? Strabo, Pausanias, and Appian merely record the coup without much detail. But Memnon adds, he formed a plot, fell upon his benefactor, and killed him. Then he jumped on a horse and rushed to Lysimachia, where he put on a diadem and, escorted by a splendid bodyguard, went out to meet the army. They were forced to accept him and call him king, though he had previously served under Seleucus. What Memnon says here is, in fact, quite absurd. Caraunus certainly could not have forced Seleucus soldiers to acknowledge him as king, and so one must suppose that they either supported Caraunus, despised Seleucus, or were otherwise indifferent to Seleucus's murder. The Babylonian chroniclers shed some light on this event, noting that Seleucus' own troops were in revolt at this time. It is thus reasonable to assume that Caraunus felt emboldened to stage this coup precisely because he knew that Seleucus' own soldiers were not especially loyal to the king. Why the soldiers revolted, of course, is nowhere stated. However, Seleucus's death seems to have triggered a series of popular uprisings throughout Seleukid territory. OGIS 219, which dates to about 280 BCE, notes that the cities of the Seleucids and possibly Asia Minor were in open revolt, and that Antiochus I had to use military force to resubjugate them. Moreover, Polyaenus records an uprising in Persis, which Granger and Sherwin-White and Kurt date to this same year. Sherwin-White and Kurt, in fact, also connect the destruction of the citadel at Pasargadae in 280 BCE with this uprising in Persis, which they feel indicates an anti-Seleukid, or at least might indicate an anti-Seleukid response to the news of Seleucus' death. We might then imagine that the revolt of Seleucus' own troops, his assassination carried out by Coronis with impunity, the revolts across Asia Minor, the Seleucids, and in Persis, all point to widespread popular discontent with Seleukid suzerainty. Over what specifically, of course, it is impossible for us to say. We can't really even say if those revolts were connected or had the same cause. We only know that they occurred. Of course, these were early days indeed for the Seleucids, but if we jump ahead to the reign of Seleucus II and the outbreak of the Third Syrian War, popular reactions to Ptolemy's incursions into Seleukid-controlled territory seem to range from indifference to openly hostile, openly anti-Seleukid hostility. Porphyrius notes in OGIS 54 seems to confirm that Ptolemy succeeded in overrunning much of Syria, Cilicia, and territory beyond the Euphrates, before a rebellion in Egypt ultimately forced him to withdraw. The extent and rapidity of Ptolemy's advance is startling and might suggest that he encountered little to no resistance. A papyrus originating in the Ptolemaic court perhaps supports this observation. In Soloi, the common people appear to have opened their gates to Ptolemy, turning over some 1,500 talents, and the Seleukid general Arabazes had to flee beyond the Taurus, where it said some local people, they're not named, beheaded him. Allowing room for propaganda on the part of Ptolemy's court here, this document suggests the possibility of some Seleukid sentiment not only at Soloi itself, but also vaguely beyond the Taurus, as Arabazes' fate would certainly seem to indicate. The document also indicates that Antioch and Seleucia similarly capitulated to Ptolemy. Taken together, then, the evidence suggests, at a minimum, a clear lack of interest in defending a specifically Seleukid royal authority. Now, Justin notes, again, perhaps somewhat hyperbolically, that universi civitates went over to Ptolemy, adding that many of the Antiochenes in particular seem to have gone to Ptolemy out of hatred for Seleucus. Justin suggests that the Antiochenes were enraged at the treatment of Berenike and her infant son, but this explanation makes little sense given what follows. When the Antiochenes learned that Seleucus had just lost his fleet in a storm, they suddenly felt bad for his reversal of fortune, a commonly used cliche in Justin, I might add, and as we'll see a little later, and returned to the Seleukid fold. This again, of course, is absurd because the destroyed fleet was coming to exact revenge on the Antiochenes themselves for their revolt in the first place. Justin's explanation for the change of attitude is entirely implausible. A more logical explanation would be that the Antiochenes were alarmed at the sudden withdrawal of Ptolemy's troops, which left them exposed to Seleucus's vengeance. The fortuitous loss of Seleucus' fleet afforded the Antiochenes some space to make amends and to express regret simply in order to ward off a potentially catastrophic or horrific punishment. It is, however, improbable that their disdain, which caused them to revolt in the first place, would have dissipated so suddenly. Now, the reign of Seleucus II, as we know, was a troubled one. He died in later 226 and was succeeded by Seleucus III, whose reign was brief and similarly infelicitous. Appian notes that in 223, his Philoi murdered him because of his weakness and, not insignificantly, because his army was rebellious. Molon's revolt against Antiochus III shortly followed Seleucus's death, And according to Polybius, Molon managed to mobilize both the leading men and the common folk. Ochloi, or ochlus, is the word that Polybius uses, inspiring them with hope of profit. Before contemplating such a bold move, however, Molon would have needed a critical mass of popular support. Moreover, he probably knew that he could count on the indifference of the local populations in the eastern satrapies. And indeed, he was not disappointed in this assumption. Polybius thus notes that Molon took Babylon and Susa without a struggle in a sweeping advance resembling that of Ptolemy III in the Third Syrian War. Moreover, Polybius notes that while at Apamea preparing to march against Molon, Antiochus's own troops mutinied over arrears in pay. Hermias, Polybius tells us, made good the arrears out of his own funds, which stimulated feelings of revulsion for Antiochus among his own troops. Worse still, 6,000 Serhestai remained in open revolt and had to be defeated and killed. After Molon's defeat, Antiochus encountered no pro-Molon resistance. The communities that submitted to Molon without a fight now submitted to Antiochus without a fight. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the revolt of Antiochus here, Achaeus, pardon me, here, and just note that we can discern a similar sort of a pattern in that dynamic as well. What then does the behavior of the rank and file soldiery and the ordinary people in these curious events tell us about how they viewed royal authority? Peoples of the upper satrapies flocked to Molon out of hope of material gain, and so their loyalty to the Seleukid dynasty thus appeared thin and certainly had a price on it. Moreover, Antiochus's own troops similarly had a price, and for the Serhestai, no amount of money could purchase their loyalty for Antiochus. The populations of Babylon, Susa, and other communities made no attempt to defend the Seleukid royal authority, nor did they defend Molon's claims. In either case, the Ochloi appear to be quite indifferent to either contender. The events that followed Antiochus's return from his vaunted Anabasis, however, shed a brighter light on what might have actually been going on here. In about 200 BCE, Seleucus availed himself of the death of Ptolemy IV and the minority of Ptolemy V to swallow up Ptolemaic holdings in Coele-Syria, Cilicia, and Lycia, and by 197 he commenced the subjugation of Ionia, Aeolia, and the cities of the Hellespont before crossing into Thrace. His justification for subjugating these territories, so he would eventually tell the Roman delegation at the conference at Lysimachia the following year, was that these were part of his ancestral patrimony and so were rightfully his. Appian notes that Antiochus attacked the Hellespontines and the Aeolians and the Ionians as these belonged to the ruler of Asia and because long ago they had obeyed the king of Asia. Livy similarly adds, in this same year, King Antiochus, when he had wintered at Ephesus, attempted to return the cities of Asia to the ancient form of rule. In other words, Antiochus claimed the right to rule these territories because they had belonged to the Seleukid house by right of conquest. But these pseudo-legal niceties represent the view of Antiochus himself and not those of the cities he claimed as subject to Seleukid royal authority. Appian notes that as he pursued the Greek cities, many sided with him and admitted garrisons out of fear of being captured. And Livy likewise adds that Antiochus saw that some would accept the yoke without difficulty, either because they were located in a plain or because they trusted too little in their walls and armed forces and in their young men. In other words, many of the cities that submitted to Antiochus did so out of fear and not out of acceptance of Antiochus's self-serving claim to legitimate royal authority in Asia Minor. However, when confronted by overwhelmingly superior military force, the weaker cities felt that they had no choice but to capitulate. Beliefs about Seleukid claims to legitimate royal authority in Asia Minor, in other words, were thus only relevant to Antiochus himself. Those that could resist did. Livy notes that Smyrna and Lampsacus were seizing their opportunity and that there was a danger lest the other cities in the Aeolid, Ionia, and the Hellespont should follow Smyrna and Lampsacus if what they were striving for should be granted to them. Antiochus laid siege to both cities while the Smyrnaeans and the Lampsacians demanded full independence. Antiochus responded that he would grant them that autonomy and freedom if they acknowledged that it was Antiochus who conferred them, a demand that both cities clearly rejected. This, of course, is the surrender and grant model of royal authority articulated by both Bickerman and Ma, but this is the king's view of royal authority. The Smyrnaeans and the Lampsacines clearly viewed royal claims to legitimate authority rather differently. For the cities of Asia Minor, freedom granted by the king was not freedom at all. Real freedom entailed both not merely internal local autonomy, but complete sovereign autonomy, both internally and in foreign matters. Participation in the surrender and grant formula articulated by Ma and others was thus not a voluntary one, but was motivated by fear arising from the asymmetrical power relations between king and city. Acquiescence to royal claims to legitimate royal authority should not then necessarily connote acceptance of those claims. Now, I've already noted how Antioch and other cities in Syria had abandoned Seleucus II in the Third Syrian War, and how quickly they returned to the fold again for what I would contend were entirely pragmatic reasons. The Antiochenes revolted again against Demetrius I in the later 150s. Justin provides a rather bizarre narrative about Oriphanes, the brother of Ariarathes of Cappadocia, who fled to Demetrius as a suppliant from a dynastic struggle at home. The details of that struggle don't really concern me here. However, Justin does note that Oriphanes conspired with the people of Antioch to eject Demetrius as king, weirdly adding that the Antiochenes were willing to oblige because they were enraged at Antiochus. But why should the Antiochenes support Oriphanes, according to Justin? Moreover, if they were angry at Antiochus, whether this is Antiochus IV or V is not entirely clear, the revolt must have been brewing prior to Demetrius' defeat of Lysias and his ward Antiochus V in 162. And if this is true, why revolt against Demetrius at all? One thing is very clear, and that is the loathing among the Antiochenes. The Antiochene disdain for the Seleukid house is obvious enough from what follows. Justin notes that when Demetrius I marched on Antioch to crush the revolt, the Antiochenes rallied around Alexander Ballas. Justin describes Ballas's Seleukid pedigree as utterly contrived, adding that such was the detestation of Demetrius among all classes that not only royal power, but also nobility of birth was unanimously attributed to his rival. The truth behind Ballas's pedigree, of course, is not my concern here. What matters here is that Demetrius was allegedly despised by all classes of people, and that most of the entire East, according to Justin, went over to Ballas. Even allowing for hyperbole on Justin's part here, which surely we must, there appears to be no denying the popular discontent with Demetrius I, and that Antioch was in open defiance of his authority, regardless of the legitimacy of his claim to that royal authority. Now, our story gets stranger still. Justin, in a scene reminiscent of the Antiochene revolt against Seleucus II, notes that the Antiochenes suddenly repented of their revolt against Demetrius I, noting only that they did this to atone for their injuries to the father by new services to the son, Demetrius II. They revolted against Ballas, whom they had put forth against Demetrius I. Justin's Antiochenes are thus incomprehensibly erratic, but their behavior, unexamined as it is by Justin, does make sense if we suppose that that they did not favor any of these. It makes sense if we suppose that they did not favor any of the contenders because what they actually wanted was their independence from Seleukid kings altogether. The revolts that Demetrius' seizure of royal title initiated, such as those of Timarchus and Philip, revolts which themselves must have had sufficient popular support to even be considered, no doubt held out hope that the Antiochenes might be successful in an attempt at independence. John Granger, tantalizingly, I think, notes that in 145 BCE, Apamea, Laodicea, Seleucia, and Antioch appear to have leagued together as brother cities for a short period, based on civic coinage from this period, although I have to admit that I have not had a chance to actually explore that particular claim in any detail. However, if Granger's claim turns out to be correct, then this would lend additional weight to the argument that civil revolts in Syria in the 140s were more about independence from Seleukid rule than about hostility or sympathy toward any specific king per se. Nor did Demetrius II fare any better than his father Arbalus with the Antiochenes and the common soldiery. Josephus observes that after Demetrius II had defeated Balus and secured his reign to his satisfaction, he reduced his soldiers' pay and dismissed a large number of them, and that this procured him the ill will and hatred from the soldiers, calling to mind the mutiny faced by Antiochus III. Once again, loyalty to the Seleukid house had to be purchased, and thus must have been rather thin, at least among the common soldiery. The claims of the Seleukid kings to royal legitimacy are just not relevant factors in securing the loyalty of Seleukid soldiers, at least not as relevant as timely and sufficient pay. Nor did such claims matter to the average Antiochene. Josephus goes on to note that the Antiochenes hated Demetrius, the very king to whom they allegedly defected from Balus, to whom in turn they had defected from Demetrius I. Indeed, Demetrius needed to enlist the services of Jonathan in a Jewish mercenary army to bring the Antiochenes to order. When the Antiochenes, sorry, am I on the right slide here? Apologies. I think this is where we need to be.
All right, good.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. When the Antiochenes received news that Jonathan was en route with an army, they took their weapons immediately and encompassed his palace in the way of a siege. And seizing upon all the ways of getting out, they sought to subdue their king. In the final scene, Jonathan arrives with his force, and after a violent battle, the Antiochenes, or many Antiochenes, were massacred. Thus relieved, Demetrius II could consolidate his grip. All right, just let me make sure my slides line up here. In 139, Demetrius II marched east to meet Mithridates' armies, which had swept through Media and Babylonia, leaving behind a young son, Antiochus, in the care of his philos Diodotus. In 138, Mithridates defeated Demetrius and took him hostage. Meanwhile, in Syria, Demetrius's brother assumed the diadem and Demetrius's wife, Cleopatra Thea, while Diodotus managed to rid himself of his royal ward. Whether through skullduggery or accident is not entirely clear. Josephus then adds that the hatred that Demetrius II incurred among both the common soldiery and the Antiochenes caused both, along with Apamea, to support the usurper Diodotus. Josephus adds that Diodotus secured the loyalty of both the soldiers and the common people in Syria. Note here that the legal standing or legitimacy of the Seleukid house are again not factors for the loyalty of the common folk or for the soldiery. The soldiers serving under Antiochus VII, in fact, revolted and going over to Cleopatra Thea, the erstwhile wife of both Balus and Demetrius II. One cannot imagine why they would have done this, except perhaps that they felt that they were more likely to be paid by Thea than by Demetrius. In any case, Thea, now in possession of Antiochus's troops, proffered a marriage connection with Antiochus, who significantly had been unable to gain entrance to, as Josephus says, any of the cities on account of Tryphon. She offered the marriage connection, Josephus tells us, because she was afraid for herself she was afraid for herself in case some of the people of Seleucia should deliver up the city to Tryphon, suggesting that Seleucia and many of the other cities in Syria were of questionable loyalty to the Seleukid house. Now, Antiochus VII, after eventually defeating Tryphon and consolidating his grip on power, marched east, perhaps in 130, to confront the Parthians who had overrun much of the eastern satrapies with relatively little resistance, I might add. Antiochus' advance was rapid. Justin notes, many kings of the East met Antiochus on his march, offering him themselves and their kingdoms, and expressing the greatest detestation of Parthian pride. Nor was there any delay in coming to an engagement. Antiochus, being victorious in 3 battles and having got possession of Babylon, began to be thought a great man. All the neighboring people, in consequence, joining him, nothing was left to the Parthians but their own country. But affairs turned sour for Antiochus rather swiftly. Justin then notes, on account of the number of his forces, Antiochus had distributed his army in winter quarters throughout several cities. And his dispersion was the cause of his ruin. For the cities, finding themselves harassed by having to furnish supplies and by the depredations of the soldiers, revolted to the Parthians, and on an appointed day conspired to fall upon the army divided among them, so that the several divisions might not be able to assist each other. When Antiochus then met the Parthians on the field, his own men seem to have deserted him. The peoples of the eastern satrapies went over to the Parthians and then just as easily rallied around Antiochus until the imposition of troops and their associated costs bit too deeply, at which point they defected back to Mithridates. The Parthians, of course, released Demetrius II, allowing him to return to Syria as king in 129. And Justin notes that he returned to revolts in Antioch and Apamea, arising out of hatred for the king, but which Justin says actually occurred during his absence in Parthia, which I take to mean during the reign of Antiochus VII. Moreover, he cast, so we're told, covetous eyes on Egypt, and Ptolemy, wishing to preempt Demetrius's ambitions, put forth yet another pretender, Protarchus, who they named Alexander Sabinus. The people of Syria played along with the fiction, refusing, as Justin says, no man for their king if they might be freed from the insolence of Demetrius. But given that the Antiochenes were already in revolt before Demetrius's return and were routinely in revolt from the reign of Demetrius I forward, their problems could hardly have been with Demetrius II alone. Rather than refusing no man for their king, it seems that they refused every man as their king and only accepted kings as necessity dictated. In any case, Sabinus, after driving Demetrius II from power, was himself driven from power, as we're told, by an uprising of the people after he's said to have melted down the golden statue of Zeus. The invention of a Seleukid pedigree for the likes of Ballas and Sabinus does perhaps call for some explanation. In the case of Ballas, we can perhaps dismiss the story of his low origin as propaganda from the court of Demetrius I. As for Sabinus, we need not assume such a pedigree carried any currency with the common people, or that the fiction of his Seleukid lineage was even aimed at the hoi polloi, for whom such pedigree does not seem to have actually mattered. Indeed, it might even have proven to be something of a liability. Rather, such pedigrees would have been necessary for cementing relations with other powerful dynasts as potential allies and collaborators, for whom such pedigrees did matter. But the common people and rank-and-file soldiery, even in the Seleukid heartland itself, seem to have had little regard for the Seleukid name per se. Open defiance is the clearest evidence that local communities did not always accept Seleukid claims to the rightful exercise of legitimate political authority. Open popular revolt, in many instances arising explicitly out of hatred for the king, was common across the vast expanse of Seleukid territory and throughout Seleukid history. Moreover, even the quiescence of putatively Seleukid subject communities does not necessarily mean that those Seleukid communities assented to Seleukid claims to royal authority. When confronted with overwhelming power, many communities out of fear acquiesced. Finally, the hoi polloi seem to have had little regard for the pseudo-legal subtleties of royal claims to legitimate authority. One king was like another and could be tolerated so long as they did not exercise their local authority, their local claims to power, too aggressively. In spite of their efforts to construct a consensus then, Seleukid power rested first and foremost on fear and intimidation, and calls to mind the military juntas of Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, and of the various authoritarian regimes across much of the modern Middle East. In 2018, revolts swept across many countries in North Africa and the Middle East in an event that came to be known as the Arab Spring. Most of them were eventually broken. Quiescence returned. But does this quiescence connote a consensus? Has the discontent that sparked the Arab Spring suddenly dissipated? We would be naive to think that quiescence and capitulation connote assent to claims of legitimate authority. Widespread uprisings are a far more honest and raw response to such claims. After all, words are cheap, but open defiance actually risks something, since lives are at stake. Just to conclude then, I am not saying that there can be found no examples of genuine local popular loyalty to the Seleukid regime. I would note, however, that those loyalties were not necessarily all that deep and were by and large instrumental. Moreover, we cannot take those loyalties for granted based solely on acquiescence to and participation in the theater of royal authority alone. Finally, if open revolt and defiance were so common, then how are we to read the silences? To really understand how constituent polities received Seleukid claims to royal authority, we need to move beyond the view of the kings themselves and how they viewed and constructed their own authority, the view found in royal correspondence and embedded in civic inscriptions and documents, propagandistic documents arising in the royal court, which only gives us access to one side of a dialogue. We must look more deeply at local behavior and reactions to the Seleukid exercise of royal authority, for it's the interplay of king and community across the vast expanse of Seleukid space and time that the trajectory of Seleukid history ultimately takes shape. Thank you very much for your time and patience.
Thank
How do I
Thank
stop
you very
sharing?
much, Richard. Well, you can.
I see.
You should do the undo. Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Richard. And without further ado, I pass on the word to Kaya.
So, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Altay. Thank you, Ben, for organizing. Richard, that was a fascinating talk, and I want to pick up on several things that you've made me think about in relation to that. And the first is around how we've discussed the interplay of royal propaganda, royal image making, and its function to I can't say that word, to effectively hide Seleucid reliance on force, and how different that is from other ancient empires, and whether or not there is a set level in antiquity of governing structures, and whether or not sort of a desire for freedom or more powerful protector is not the default, and whether or not those images of or the selection of rebellion that we see in the source material is a reaction to that when an opportunity arises. And so I was thinking through your examples and wondering how much context for rebellion or the situations in which a rebellion arises are significant. So I was also wondering whether or not the examples need to be split or grouped in slightly different ways. The first, and I think you've articulated it well, is the army seems to at least have recorded reasons for rebelling in most cases, which often seem to revolve around whether or not they're paid, and whether or not army rebellions and army mutinies are a slightly separate category in and of themselves of acquiescence to rule, given their sort of desire for pay, their baggage, or protection, or more generally just victory, and whether or not the army is its own category rather than the populations within cities. And within that, I was looking at your examples and thinking about them. They sort of seem to group into roughly 4 time periods, and I'm wondering if those are significant. So the first is that period in Asia Minor around Seleucus's defeat of Lysimachus, and then very shortly thereafter, so within a year or so, the death of Seleucus, and wondering if that period of transition is what spurs this. The second is the Third Syrian War, in which you have an outside influence, and also another set of transitions. The third is that early reign for Antiochus III, when he's attempting to establish himself, and you get new locuses of potential resistance to the king emerging. And then the last part is the period where the Seleucids are becoming increasingly chaotic, and there were more of them around following the death of Antiochus IV and the 2 multiple branches of the dynasty. And that was making me wonder whether or not that desire for, or the ability to express rebellion that shows up in the sources comes out in particular categories, i.e., the king is dead, the king is really far away and bogged down in something else and isn't paying attention to us, or the king is very weak. And all of those are effectively the king's monopoly on force is questioned substantially. And is that the question that makes us trigger where rebellion might arise, rather than looking across where potential royal ideology is successful or not? Is it the practical ability of people to resist the king's force, or to drag somebody else in to resist the king's force, that allows rebellion to happen? And so, thinking of your examples, Ptolemy Keranos functions as a figure. The Ptolemaic invasion functions as a figure. And I think you point out well that when that promised support or potential support fails, you see that acquiescence back into the Seleucid fold, or in another empire in the Ptolemaic fold. Again, you see that with Milan. And whether or not that coalescing around a figure of support is also necessary. And I think that's probably interesting in that context of the Arab Spring, where we saw much of the Arab Spring seem to hope on American support that never arose. And then you see acquiescence back into effectively the power dynamics. But I don't think any of that underlines the point that there is an underbelly of resistance that could spring up at any point, anywhere in the empire, where that monopoly of force is significantly questioned, and that it's the looking for locuses of where the king's monopoly of force becomes weak, and no accounting of ideology will ever be able to override it. And does that bring us back to the question of Sherwin White and Kurt 30, 40, however long ago it was, of how embedded the Seleucid Empire is? Does it have strong ties into the local populations, or is it effectively an overarching bit? I don't think we greatly need to reopen that debate, but I was thinking in comparison of Alexander's own campaign of how cities abandoned Darius, of that there is an outside force that moves in. It's better for us now to make that calculation to switch sides. But that means that is nothing. That is Plutarch's false declarations of praise, but also of loyalty. And the Seleucids, with the inability to effectively be everywhere at all times, how much does that impact on how we understand where rebellion arises? I don't have answers for any of those things. And I'm not sure anyone does, but I'm hoping, Richard, you might.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to reply to some of that. Thank you for that, Kyle. And that was an excellent summary of what I'm trying to argue. Your points about periodization and how we group these various rebellions together, of course, is helpful and will give me a lot to think about as I write this up more formally. Right. So I would start, at least initially, by stressing what I sort of alluded to in my talk, which is that when it comes to popular revolts, first of all, given that our sources are not particularly interested in the hoi polloi or what's motivating them, as the vision is focused, of course, squarely on kings and dynasts and the major players, as it were, we don't really know necessarily, at least not with any sort of granularity of detail about what's motivating them, right? So the evidence can only ever be impressionistic and suggestive. We only know that there is, in fact, a revolt. Specifically over what, it is impossible for us to say, right? We only have the fact of the revolt themselves. Moreover, in response, I suppose, to what you said about Sherwin White and Kurt's thesis and not wanting to open it up, in a sense, that's exactly what I'm doing. I would suggest that Seleukid ideology is less embedded in local communities than is traditionally assumed, at least more recently assumed. And that the relations between Seleukid kings and local communities, as I mentioned, were largely instrumental, right? There's a quid pro quo between king and local power brokers, local dynasts, for example, who benefit from one another's support. The Seleukid kings thus sit at the center of a nexus of bilateral relations between the king and the court on the one hand and local power brokers on the other. And this is where, ironically, the size of the Seleucid Empire, which you had alluded to in your comments, actually proved to be an advantage, ironically, rather than a disadvantage, right? We know that the Seleukid Empire is this vast, geographically expansive entity made up of a myriad of different polities. But this is exactly what allowed the Seleukid kings to sort of play a game of divide and conquer. By operationalizing their instrumental relations with one particular community, they would be able to use those resources or leverage those resources to put out fires or revolts in other communities. The possibility that a revolt in one small part of the Seleukid Empire could spread to the entire empire is therefore less likely, right? That's actually advantageous. So this idea that the sprawling nature of the Seleukid imperial enterprise was actually tended toward the undermining of imperial stability, I think it works in exactly the opposite direction, right? It makes divide and conquer more possible. We could compare that, for example, with the uprisings in Ptolemaic Egypt, native revolts in Ptolemaic Egypt, which in many ways were, I think, far more serious because they could be more widespread, right, involving a much greater swathe of the Ptolemaic polity than would be the case in the Seleukid world. Does that address some of the points you raised?
Yeah, absolutely. Just because of my own interests on royal propaganda and sitting that within sort of Ma's framework, how I've always it gives the Seleucids and the elites a framework to talk about that instrumentalism.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't think it's ever meaningful necessarily on any side, and looking for it to be legitimately understood as a real thing by either party.
Mm-hmm.
I think, but I might be too cynical.
No, I think that cynicism is warranted. I mean, politics is a cynical game, and I don't think there was really a time when it wasn't cynical. When it's in my best interest to acknowledge the authority of the king, then I'll acknowledge the authority of the king until I no longer acknowledge it, until it's inconvenient, right? And then I reject it.
I want to ask more things, but I don't want to monopolize people's times. But I want to pick up to things on that you've written elsewhere of how does that fit in with how groups like Bactria or Parthia could fit into that Seleucid discourse and exploit that instrumentalism.
Well, that's difficult to answer, of course, because again, what do we have as sources? We have the dialogue between the Diodatid or the Euthydemoid kings and the Seleukid kings, right? As captured in numismatics and in well, really primarily in numismatics in the case of Bactria. Um, what that actually tells us about the local populations underpinning local authority or Seleukid authority, or the reactions to Seleukid claims to authority, it really doesn't tell us much about how they reacted to those claims. It would be a bit like trying to reconstruct the history of what would be a good example? The last several years in the United States, using only speeches from Donald Trump.
God forbid.
Right? We would have an especially skewed view of what has transpired over the last 4 years. Right? Reading those speeches, we would think that he was an incredibly popular president and was universally supported and so forth, right? Because this is propaganda, as it were, emerging out of the royal court, right? So it tells us very little about what the ordinary soldiers felt, how local populations felt. Even the uprisings themselves, I fully admit, are at best only impressionistic. They're only evidence of uprisings, right? They do perhaps point in a particular direction, and when we hold that against other pieces of evidence which show that cities and other polities go over to the Seleucids largely as a result of fear, then those revolts take on a particular light. I think they point in a particular direction. Beyond what Appian and Livy have to say about the activities of Antiochus III in Asia Minor, we might also point out that Josephus in Jewish Antiquities, when he's talking about the incursions of the troops of Antiochus IV into Jerusalem, notes that many went over, as he says, out of fear, right? And regarded Macedonian rule as slavery. Douleia is the word that he uses. And he says this several times at the end of book 12 and I think the beginning of book 13, right? He articulates quite clearly that many acquiesced to Seleukid authority simply out of fear, right? So all of that has to sort of at least call into question what quiescence or acquiescence in Seleukid claims to authority really even mean, right? How significant is that acquiescence? And if we're really to understand then the dynamics of how Seleukid history unfolds, we really need, and this is sort of the looking forward piece to that I'm trying to raise it. What's required, I think, is a kind of region by region, highly local series of studies articulating relations between king and a particular locality, right? Focusing not just on the propagandistic exchanges between king and city or king and dynast, but what people actually do on the ground, how they actually respond with action to the exercise of royal authority.
Okay, so thank you. So if people would like to ask questions, if you would chat to me, Ben Scolnic. If you don't, I'm going to ask 15 questions, so I hope you do. So Richard, first of all, thank you. And Kyle, thank you for those responses. A very stimulating discussion. I think a very important corrective, right, to a lot of the ways that we think. If I can ask you a couple of questions, Richard, and some of this will be piggybacking on Kyle, I think. I'm thinking about a phrase, typology of resistance, right? And there are different types. This is what I think Kyle was getting at, right? A military coup or a mutiny is not the same thing as a native revolt, And I'm thinking, because all of us write a lot and we're always bleeding for structure. I'm thinking about the structure of a presentation that might focus on this type, and as opposed to this type. That is, here are military coups. I mean, Alexander certainly had his mutinies and everything. Everybody has been. That's one kind of thing, as Kyle pointed out, that might have to do with pay, or we don't like how far you're going in this area. You're going off to India. We don't like that. So that's one type of resistance, but that's very different than another one. I also want to think about the word fickle for a minute. Fickle, I think, has a negative connotation. I'm thinking about fluidity of popularity. You were just talking about my ex-president, thank God. So there's ebb and flow with popularity. A president or a king can be very popular at the beginning when people are expecting changes that he's promised, and then they start hating him. But fickleness is a kind of negative judgment. Oh, these people are fickle. They thought this and then they thought that, as opposed to, changeability, fluidity of popularity, which will happen during any reign. So that's one point. When you talked about regionalization, and I'm very excited about the prospects about where these things can go. I mean, I could see a whole conference just stemming from what you've given us. But I'm thinking about elite versus non-elite. I'm thinking about center versus periphery. In other words, I'm very struck with the Antioch examples because that's in the center. And yet that's where you had all this unrest. I might have expected more unrest on the periphery, when I had that chance like Kyle was talking about. The Third Syrian War is endlessly fascinating about what's happening there. And you really drew a lot of that out. And I'm still not sure I have my head around what happened and why the city of Antioch changed. So that's just a couple of points. But again, I want to stress, I think we need a typology of resistance. I mean, you pointed out all the resistance. Now, if you could separate the types, and one more point, and then I'll shut up. Chronology, and I think Kyle was getting at this. If you have Seleucus the First, you don't have a dynasty yet, right? That's very different than your Demetrius examples. After all of that time, you might have expected more solidity, if that's a word, more permanence to the Seleukid reign after all that time. I wouldn't have expected it after one king. Who knew what was going to happen after that? So those, again, there's, chronology is very important here too.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. As I mentioned, I'll just take what you said in reverse order and start with chronology. As I mentioned, in the case of the revolts against Seleucus I, or immediately following the death of Seleucus I, those were, as I mentioned, early days. And so it is perhaps understandable that Seleucid authority might not have been as entrenched as it would have been in later periods, right? So that is certainly a significant observation. As far as your other remarks go, I like the idea of fluidity of popularity. I think that is an interesting observation. Of course, the popularity or lack thereof of a leader ebbs and flows over time, and this ties in significantly with what you have noted about the typology of revolts and its relation to fickleness. As I tried, at least I hope I was clear, but I tried to sort of indicate again that I don't think that we can really necessarily do that, right? Other than revolts and mutinies mentioned sort of in passing, none of these are actually dissected in any significant way, right? We're not really given the reasons for them, right? They're only suggestive, right? They're only suggestive of popular discontent of some kind, right? I, however, would say that that popular discontent, when set alongside the frequency of usurpers or would-be usurpers in Seleukid themselves must have been able to at least relies upon and provide for significant discontent. Those two things then set alongside of the seeming indifference of local populations to which king particularly reigns locally, provided that they don't exercise their royal authority too aggressively. In other words, when they remain distant and respect local autonomy to the maximum degree, that's the preferred king, right? But that doesn't mean that they prefer a king. That doesn't mean that they prefer any king. It only means that the kings are a fact of life. They are part of the political landscape. They have to be dealt with. The option of not capitulating to one of them is probably not on the table in any case, right? And so they are more likely to favor the king who will be perhaps the least interventionist in local terms, right? Hence the, as I said, the lack of effort or vigor in defending this particular case, salute royal authority, right? It's not a hill they're willing to die on. I mean, literally.
Good. Okay, thank you. We're going to call on Martin Fisher. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much indeed, Richard, for your fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. It's been great to dive back into Seleucid things with these talks, so I'm really, really happy. And I was wondering, because on some extent I really agree with some of your points, and especially the fact that the people of the Seleucid Empire didn't really care much about all these pseudo-legal claims, as you call them, about the kind of claim they have to all these lands. But on the other hand, what I do wonder a little bit about, when you talk about the hoi polloi and the normal people and the revolts, to what extent do you differentiate, for example, in Antioch or in any city, where the local city elites are actually the drivers of this revolt and the population just kind of goes with them, and then go back to the Seleucids out of fear? But I guess who wouldn't be afraid when the king and the army come to your city gate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is it driven by the kind of common people and their indifference, or is it driven by the local elites and their interests? And I didn't hear that distinction so clearly in your talk, but I think that could be a very fascinating thing. And when we zoom into, as it were, the other side of the story, I think interesting things could really happen. It's a shame we have so much more evidence on the one side than on the other. But yes, and so the other thing that I wanted to say is that you mentioned this in your talk, but the example with the Ptolemies, I think, might be slightly more problematic, because you get so into the Ptolemaic royal ideology and propaganda that adds a whole new dimension to the problem again. But you did note this, but I think that is an important point when you discuss those cases.
Absolutely, those are both excellent points. I wouldn't presume to speak for the Ptolemaic context. Certainly not at this point. And you're quite right. I mean, we cannot parse out the ochloi, right? We cannot parse them out. Our sources don't parse them out, and common sense even dictates that we realize that the crowd, whatever that is, right, is necessarily a composite entity, isn't it? It's not a monolith, right? And so there could be people who join a revolt for any number of possible reasons, right? some, based purely out of self-interest, others based out of more politically, based on more politically doctrinaire reasons and so on. We can't really know that for sure, right? Again, all we know is the fact of the revolt, right? And so, as is often the case in Seleukid historical reconstructions generally, we have at best this process where we make general inferences from what really amounts to anecdotal evidence, right? We don't have the ability to question the crowd. And again, our sources just simply aren't interested in the crowd, right? They are fickle. They change loyalties between kings and so on. It doesn't occur to any of our sources that what they might be aiming at, and again, this is just merely a possibility, is independence, right? Independence from Seleukid kings altogether, right? You open your gates to one king because, again, as I said, defending the previous king's royal authority is not a hill that you're willing to die on. It's a survival strategy, and it may suit you just fine if both contenders end up destroying each other in the process, right? Why get involved? Why get involved at all?
Altay, I'm sure you want to say some things.
Well, thanks, Richard again, and also Kyle again. And this I would like to echo Ben, and I would also like to echo him with the encouragement to all participants to just speak up, ask questions, or contribute, especially the many students. We are very pleased to see so many young faces. So do not feel that you have to hesitate. Everyone is really welcome to ask or to speak out. Richard, we've had many conversations before, but I think every time we come back to it, our conversation is at a higher level of sophistication and of a better understanding of each other's views. And I fully agree that you have a strong point, that the strength of your point mainly resides in the fact that the sources that you draw on really have a large spread from the very beginning to the very end of Seleukid history, and quite
We've lost
attributed to a broad layer, whether it's society or the soldiery. There are, however, some weaknesses or say challenges. Some of them can be dealt with and may actually, when they have been integrated even more efficiently, and I know you have a much more detailed written version where you address many of these things. So some of these challenges may actually confirm your point. I mean, especially cases where I or Ben might say, well, if we look at that specific source, we might actually see that the Seleucids were not yet long in rule, or they had lost their grip of it and they didn't really control the area for long. And you would say, well, exactly that's what I'm saying. They didn't have the power grip, and as soon as there was no power relation, and it might have seemed convenient to just reject Seleukid rule. So there are many such cases that would not contradict your view, though it would be good in a written version to really qualify many of the sources. There are other sources, and I'm looking specifically at cases such as Justin, because there is a really recurring pattern. While you clearly say the hoi polloi do not fall under the gaze of our ancient sources, that's actually not true for Justin. He brings in the common people's view time and again. And I would actually claim he does this completely or largely fictionally.
Yeah.
And it seems to be part of Justin's moralizing framework. The king or a queen does something immoral, and there needs to be retaliation. And retaliation either there is some kind of divine justice, or very often there is a more immediate response. The masses are displeased and respond violently, and here you get it, you get your morale out of the misdeed. And many of these cases can easily be deconstrued. I think specifically of the rule of Demetrius I, who is heavily distorted in Justin, and how he garbles the historical tradition of things that happened. That's completely counterfactual. And we see that Demetrius's rule remains strong until the until about the last year, when Ptolemy the sixth finally took the side of Ballas and Attalus, and with this everything tipped. That would be an example that might that needs to be taken into consideration when each source then gets its own discussion. It does not take away your point entirely. It's just some modification. However, there is yet another type of challenge, and that may be the major challenge. You have given us here on the slideshow only a selection of a marvelous collection of expressions of resentment, dissatisfaction, readiness to revolt. What you have not done is trying to come up with an equal or with a counterpart, namely a selection, or I mean with a collection of instances where we see strong expressions of loyalty, even in situations where the king might not actually have been in a strong situation. And I think there are many actually, and they are twofold. I don't go into details because I don't want to speak too long, but I would say that there are two types at least of such sources or reports. The one type is when a king was beaten and nearly lost his army, but quickly found access to new recruits who supported him so that he could renew the war, or when territory was lost and the king didn't even have a stronger army, but he went into the lost territory and the populace switched sides immediately as soon as the king showed up, even potentially with a weaker army. There are many such cases. They might at least qualify your perspective. And there are further sources that show the high prestige in which the Seleucids were held, even if they were far away, or even if they had ceased to rule in a certain area for a long time. But the legacy of the Seleucids, the model that they set, that would actually also be something you have to address, because if you say that ideology and legitimating strategies didn't count for much, as soon as you take away the power, then you have a problem explaining the lasting prestige of the Seleukid dynasty. So this last point is perhaps something you may want to respond to.
Yeah, I would question the idea of the lasting prestige of the dynasty. I would actually call that into question. I know that Paul Coskun, in his work, Land of the Elephant Kings, right, deals with this subject, I think, quite well, noting that with the abatement or the ebbing of Seleukid power, many cities, for example, abandon their Seleukid identity as such, whether that's expressed on coinage, whether it's expressed in foundation stories. I would point out that works like the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, completely skips over the Seleukid reign. Right, we have extensive work or extensive book dedicated to Alexander, right? and the Seleucids are completely effaced from the story altogether. They're not even mentioned, right? I think that there is significant evidence to suggest then that there is a lack of a legacy, right? That's exactly what we don't find, right? And that, I think, would support the idea then that Seleucid ideological roots, were not laid all that deeply. You mentioned the high prestige in which the Seleukid house was held. But again, I would ask, according to whom? By whom? Right? Local dynasts who had instrumental reasons, pragmatic reasons, for acknowledging that prestige. Right? It tells us nothing about how they actually regarded the Seleukid house, and still less about how the hoi polloi, broadly defined, regarded those claims. It tells us next to nothing about any of that. You mentioned expressions of loyalty, right? What would those expressions be exactly?
Well, if you ask back, and if I may respond to that, I'm thinking of 3 campaigns east, 2 by Demetrius II and 1 by Antiochus VII, when Babylonia got lost frequently in the 140s, and again in 138 when Demetrius II was finally captured. And we see, even though the kings, when they came back from Syria to reclaim their rule in Babylonia and ideally also in Media, they took Babylonia 3 times with big ease and even had great successes initially in Media before they were finally beaten. And I would conclude that there seems to be a strong loyalty, kind of a relief amongst the elites, or who were then able to mobilize the masses to give support to the returning Seleucid kings, until they were finally defeated, captured, or killed in combat by the Parthian king. So that is a recurring pattern I see in the 140s and 130s, and I really find that very impressive. If we see how quickly Seleucid coinage spread, that is a very good indicator of how quickly they could take back these territories. So loyalty, I would say, took a big part in the fighting. And there are many more such instances that I could come up with. I wouldn't say that this was always the case. I wouldn't say that this was the case for every single member of the Seleucid dynasty. But still, I think it's not really covered or considered in your overall pessimistic approach.
I would, again, Altay and I often disagree on so much, but yeah, I mean, I would suggest that the examples that you cite suggest exactly the opposite, right? The people in the upper satrapies in Babylonia and its environs seem to go over to whoever is there with standing in front of them with an army, right? There is no attempt to defend the interest of either contending party. They are on the side of whoever is there with an army. And do they really have an option in any of that, right? Is resistance even a possibility, right? Capitulation is a survival strategy, right? And so what other options do they really have? Again, the capitulation of a city says nothing about their loyalty to the regime to whom they just capitulated, right?
Well, here
it tells us
this
nothing
agreement
about that.
continues, not in principle. I concede that capitulation is a survival strategy, a very effective and important one. Of course, if only we imagine wars without capitulation, I think humankind would have been done with in the Bronze Age. But I think if we look more deeply into well, these wars, these military campaigns, they will prove you wrong, or they will urge you to modify your view, because we see that the Parthians did have their army and there were combats in Babylonia or in other parts. And I think the pattern seems to be very clear as soon as, well, there are many such instances in this time period where when a Seleukid king arrives, he's the clear preference, even though locals would have a choice between the two.
Okay, can I get another questioner in here? Would that be okay? Sure. Stephen wants to ask a question.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Yeah, sorry. I'm going to flick my headphones off just because I find it really hard talking with headphones on. It sounds weird. But yeah, thanks so much, Richard, for the paper. It was really interesting, and hi everyone. I guess what I was interested in was, I think in the paper, Richard, you talk about kind of revolt and very much kind of, I guess, military responses and uprisings and popular uprisings. And one of the questions I had was, I wondered if we're able to move beyond that discussion of revolt and into broader definitions of resistance and how we might go about doing that. And I just wanted to give kind of one example of how we might read that, and then one of the problems that we might encounter in trying to apply broader definitions of resistance to the Seleucids because of the nature of the evidence. So the thing I'm thinking of ties in with that first period of sort of revolt and problems that you identified. There's an inscription from Ilium, I think it is, and I'm doing this from memory, so forgive me if I get the details slightly wrong. But there's an inscription to Ilium put up in the reign of Antiochus I, sort of praising him for attacking the people hostile to his interests. And then there's this clause that says, as was just. And we might take that as being exactly the kind of example of loyalty that Altay is talking about, right? Of saying, hey, this is people being loyal to the ruler. But we can also, I think, situate that within the kind of framework of dialogue that Kyle was mentioning, that perhaps goes back to John Marr. And we can say, well, actually, could we read that in a different way as an example of resistance? Because what we've got here is a city telling the king that their actions were just. So really, they're arbitrating and they are claiming the right, arrogating the right to make a determination about whether or not a king's actions are legitimate or a king's actions are right or unlawful. And that perhaps actually undermines the whole notion of monarchical authority and the whole notion of law in a monarchical environment. And I think we can therefore start to read these little incidents that go beyond kind of the clear examples of revolt in slightly different ways. And so it opens up a broader question that I have for you about how do we actually define resistance and revolt in a kind of historical period? Because, you know, I think we can obviously sit here now and look at things through hindsight and look at things with contemporary definitions. And I just wonder whether there are times where we need to be careful in applying those kind of labels without necessarily considering what the reactions are of the people who were involved. And one of the challenges, of course, is we don't always know what the reactions were, and we certainly don't necessarily know what the intentions of the people who were involved in these actions were. And then the added complication, of course, is that means we might miss things if we label like that. So I guess what I'm trying to do is perhaps problematize or open up a broader discussion of the problems of exploring revolt and resistance. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I missed the very last part of what you said. You cut out.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, I guess, opening up this broader question about resistance and revolt.
Okay.
And, you know, you've been thinking about it, and I wondered what you thought the problems were and how we might go forward with it.
You raise an excellent point, and I'm actually glad you raised it, because this is the very topic of a forthcoming paper that I presented at the last Seleucid Study Day, in which I engaged with exactly the epigraphic documentation that you're talking about, civic decrees from cities honoring kings for various benefactions and so on, in which I made the argument that these can actually be read as strategies of resistance in and of themselves, right? The Seleukid kings, of course, had a particular image of themselves that they wished to propagate, an image that rested on not only their martial ability, but also on their piety, both religious piety and their devotion to family, and so on. And in these inscriptions, and I address a number of them in that particular paper, the pattern is always the same, right? The city approaches the king, conferring some kind of honors, whether it's games, a cultic offering, crowns, what have you, reminding the king inevitably of his piety and so on, of his kingly image, right? And then pointing out to the king that this king and in particular and his ancestors, previous kings, have all respected the democracy, the autonomy, and the independence of civic entity. So in other words, what they're effectively doing is utilizing the image constructed by the Seleukid kings of Seleukid kingship in a way that effectively weaponizes it against the Seleukid kings themselves in order to try to keep them at bay. So that raises the whole question of what resistance even looks like, right? I mean, revolt is one thing, and those are kind of obvious examples of resistance, right? But if we consider Scott's work, Weapons of the Weak, right? The ways in which the non-powerful entities, right? Those who don't hold power, those elements in a society, how do they resist power? How do they resist authority? Right? Revolt isn't always an option. Armed insurrection isn't always an option. So they adopt other strategies for doing that, right? And I think that's exactly what you see going on in many of the civic inscriptions, for example. Right? So resistance can take on a variety of different strategies beyond revolt. That's a great point.
Okay. Stone, did you want to ask something?
Thank you very much, Richard, for the wonderful talk. And I suppose I have a couple of extrapolations from your thesis. So it seems to me that the sort of this royal image that you were just talking about, and the Seleucids' claim to their imperial authority, instead of a sign of strength, is more of a sign of weakness. That's almost as if, in a certain sense, that they realize that they're probably very unpopular and that their power is very tenuous. And as such, they had to intentionally project their power in a way that's very, very obvious for people to see. And also, like if we consider this whole power dynamic, could it be said that these the fickle mob or the fluidity of their resistance represents perhaps inadvertently a popular or perhaps even Republican check on the power of the Seleucids? And like I'm particularly interested in the point that you made that some of these cities, they're not interested in supporting any one king. They're probably not interested in supporting any kings. And that really seems to me as if there is kind of a Republican element at play here. And like to me, this is pretty interesting because it reminds me of a thesis. This is provided by Anthony Cordalis for the Byzantium, where he wrote a book called The Byzantine Republic, People and Power in New Rome, where he argued that despite the outward trappings of a authoritarian empire, there is still very kind of a strong Republican element play in Byzantium, and the rulers, despite them being sort of shown as this like divine representative and like all powerful, but they were also being overthrown in very high regularity. So I just kind of find that very, very interesting, and I wanted to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that in the case of certainly the Greek city-states that had a tradition of precisely the sort of republicanism that you're thinking of, that we might expect that kind of reaction. And so their relationships to kings again would be instrumental, right? Kings were sometimes a threat that needed to be kept at arm's length. At other times, they could be a resource to be leveraged, depending on the interest of the particular city-state. Again, this is going to change, however, when we look at other polities in the Seleukid Empire, which of course was comprised of far more than just city-states. So this is why dynastic marriages, for example, become important in other parts of the Seleukid world. And those are the type of social and political relations then that get operationalized in that particular context, right? So again, the importance of the local considerations and the instrumental nature of the relationship between king and local polity is what I think really needs to be emphasized if we're to understand why the Seleukid dynasty does the things that it does, right?
I think,
does that answer your question?
Yes, that was very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. I think in the interest of time, and this has absolutely been terrific, and thank you, everyone. And we'll invite you to stay on, to talk afterwards. But if I could just give you a preview of coming attractions. On July 21st, we'll be treated to 2 talks. The first will be by Maria Lord on the futility of the search for line or lines. Maria will argue that Seleukid territory was not delineated by a system of borders, but was experienced and conceived of as a series of spaces through which people moved. The successors to Alexander retained a pretension to universal empire. Such a vision of space did not allow for borders as a political construct with other kingdoms. And our second talk, also on July 21st, also at 11 a.m. at least Eastern time, will be by Deirdre Klokow on connectivity and rural spaces in the Seleukid Empire. You'll see how these two go together. The Seleukid use of cities as a tool for the shaping and control of their widespread territories is understood. Less well known is the Seleukid use and development of rural spaces. And Paul Kosman will be the respondent. And then in August, on August 18th, Sylvain and Gerard will talk about the Seleukid infantry and cavalry ratios, the importance of numerical evidence for understanding Seleukid warfare. So again, everyone is welcome to stay on the discussion afterwards, but we're started holding to a program. We really thank Richard for that wonderful and stimulating presentation, and Kyle for his very wonderful remarks. And thank you all for coming. But again, please stay on if you'd like to chat. Thank you.
Thank you. Where did Kyle go? Oh, there he is.
Richard, that was
well, may I ask a question if no one's going to jump in?
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard, for your talk. And I agree with your main argument that the Seleucids ruled their empire using force and fear and caused the loathing among many people. And so it does seem like our task ahead of us is to, create that typology of the different sorts of revolts, but also to distinguish between the different motives for those revolts. So, I mean, we could say that the fear and the loathing are fairly universal, but everyone has different interests, and so those are going to drive the different revolts and the rebellions and the different forms of resistance. And so normally I would just want to focus on the local level, but your your paper got me thinking more about the Seleucid propaganda machine, which for me is strange. But I'm just wondering if you think that it's possible for us, when we're reading their inscriptions, to see if the Seleucids bothered to distinguish between the different motives that their enemies and their rebels against their power had. So do they distinguish between usurpers versus civic rebellion? And kind of related to that, do we think that they show any awareness of the realities of what their royal power had inflicted on people? And what I mean is it possible to read some of their propaganda as, I guess, kind of covering for what they had done? Or are they completely deluded? Did they really believe when they put out inscriptions or statements about how everyone loved them? Did they really believe that? I could see how, the occasional king might think, oh, everyone loves me, this is great. Whereas other kings or members of the dynasty would say, oh, well, clearly they're just, kowtowing to me now. Or are we looking at a much, much more devious program of propaganda to just completely write out all the different, atrocities that they had committed, to just write it out of the historical record as much as they could? So that's sort of a two-parter question, but more, I'm just curious what you think about the Seleucid understanding of their own behavior was, and whether we can read any of that in the sources that we do have.
I think that's a fascinating question. It isn't something that I've contemplated, but it's well worth contemplating. My knee-jerk response to that would be that, well, on the one hand, I don't think that it would be necessarily that it would be possible, I think, for us to separate, or to divine out of sources arising in the Seleukid court, Seleukid propaganda, what the Seleukid kings actually believed. In other words, I sense what you're asking is, did they proffer this propaganda disingenuously, or did they really believe it themselves, right? My knee-jerk reaction would be that they probably believed it themselves. I mean, the idea of perpetrating an atrocity on a people, I think, is a modern political view, right? I don't think that Seleukid kings, or any king for that matter, would have contemplated things in that particular way. So I would assume, it would be my assumption, that that they genuinely believed the things that they said about themselves, the image that they held out about themselves. But again, I would have to add the caveat that I haven't sort of delved into that too deeply. So
it's an interesting.
That would just be my knee-jerk response.
It's an interesting question. Did they have a moral self-consciousness? What we would, in other words, you said it very well. We use the word atrocity. Would they view it as an atrocity? Would they,
I'm sure not.
Right.
Right. I mean, I would imagine that whatever their moral conscience looked like, it would have been constructed in a way that was consistent with time and place, right? So
that is worth further thinking. It's an interesting question. Okay, well, we've officially stopped, so now we're just talking. So
yeah, that's right.
Well, then I chip in, and I actually I can echo Richard's and Ben's view, and I would be even more emphatic. I have come to believe that most tyrants, terrible leaders, or just say dubious political figures, to allow the Lord leave their righteousness. And a good example is I truly believe that Donald Trump, for example, really believes that he is very popular, that he is doing the absolute right thing, as much, I don't want to compare him to Hitler, but in the belief as being the righteous voice of the people, as much as Alexander the Great, I think, truly believed in his divinity, or at least in his divine roots and aspiration to divinity. So this is something I think very important. If you strongly believe in your own righteousness, you are in a much better position to project it out to a broader audience more efficiently. You need a circle around you of firm believers and supporters that also filter out some of, say, terminology of atrocity and so on. It does not mean that they are that every politician is completely blind and somehow innocent. I'm not going that far, but I do think that there is a very strong factor, and that's genuine to human nature. Every single one of us construes herself or himself in a more positive way, in a more righteous way than others might do, and that's very important to keep to be aware of when we deal with legitimacy, ideology, any kind of ideological communication.
But Jillian's question is still interesting. And there's the Nazis, since you brought them up, would lie, right? You know, you only lie if you know the truth. If you only lie to cut, you call it a work camp or something. So I think that what I got out of her question was, right, can we find in Seleukid propaganda big lies, right?
Okay.
Because some moral self-conscious. I mean, you're probably right in everything you just said, but can we find that? It's an interesting question.
The best place to look be if a really battle goes against the king, and the announcement is not, "Oh, we had this terrible defeat, so we have to do this," but the opposite announcement.
Right. Well, we have that like in Egypt with Ramses II or something. You're right.
Kadesh. Yeah.
Right. With Kadesh. Right. I mean, that's a big lie. You're right.
I don't know. I can't immediately think of an example of this in Hellenistic warfare, where a defeat is portrayed as a victory or not a defeat, at least.
Well, elephant victory. That's my genuine topic, the defeat of the Galatians. And even though it's something relative, it's a good example of, well, a degree of dishonesty. When a king, when a court thinks they have sort of solved a problem or curbed a problem, they may exaggerate their achievement, but there was something genuine in the claim that they had solved the Galatian problem, that Antiochus I had solved the Galatian problem in the mid-270s, even though he was far away from expelling them from Asia Minor. That's one example. And I think one recurring example is the claim of having the consensus of all, or of all the good people. Let's think of Augustan propaganda, consensus omnium, consensus universorum. That is some very typical that we find, and there's a delusional element in this, because truly every ruler knows that there is some opposition or dissent. So how should we account for this discrepancy? Should we use Ben's term of lie, and there is something of the nature of a lie included, but it may be even something more dangerous than a lie. It may be the denial of legitimacy of everyone who does not share this consent, and this one who doesn't support Augustus cannot be a true citizen, and so on. We see similar strategies in late antiquity, in 4th century sources. If we only trust the church fathers, we would think that 99% of the people in the empire were already Christians. If we read some sources of pagans, we might think that they are still the majority in the Roman Empire. That is, I haven't made up my mind completely about it, but there is a highly constructive element and even a self-delusional element in claiming that one has the support of the large majority, if not nearly of everyone, or everyone who deserves to be counted. Yeah.
It reminds me also of Brent Shaw's on banditry, on latrocinium, in which legitimate resistance movements are often dismissed in Roman sources as mere banditry.
Look at Sextus Pompey. He's a pirate.
Pardon?
Sextus Pompey is called a pirate over and over again.
Right. Exactly. It diminishes him, right?
In the Bible, they do that too. They'll call rebels bandits.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Cicero says a lot about that. Cicero uses insult, bandit, for troublemakers, unloyal people.
Some hands up there.
Rebecca has been, or sorry, Rachel's had her hand up for a while.
Oh, that's okay. I was kind of thinking about an earlier point that we had been talking about how to understand the hoi polloi and what their reaction to all of this is. And especially with the texts, obviously, they very much favor the people in power, the people writing them. So I'm really drawn to the idea of using material culture to try to understand and like what architectural forms are people using, or pottery, or even seal stones. What imagery are people using on their seals to sign their tax documents? And I mean, that's sort of where my interest lies, so that's my bias. But I think that would be a really interesting like avenue, sort of parody or textual analysis. I'm really interested in resistance, so this was really fascinating. Thank you.
That would be a fascinating approach. The difficulty with material culture and the hoi polloi is that they don't show up as well, right? By and large. So that's the real challenge there. Not to say that they don't show up at all, but it would be methodologically, I think, very slippery and difficult for sure, but worthwhile.
Can you pick up something there about at least penetration of that into an elite circle? I.e., if you're seeing elements of whatever we define as royal propaganda, royal imagery, repeated through seals beyond a certain point, does that suggest that you're getting local, at least acceptance of some version of the official version of events, or the official presentation of the dynasty?
Well, when it comes to coins and seals, is there an option to use something else?
Coins, probably not, but Rachel's probably a much better place to answer this than I am. But is there more diversity in sort of in seal usage?
I would argue yes, but I mean I'm currently working on my prospectus for my dissertation about seals at a Verucan solution, trying to think about those exact. So I'll get back to you in a year or so, maybe. But I think because there are the seals that are clearly the official ones that are larger, that look like the coins, but then there are the much smaller ones used at in all the archives that are maybe in a Babylonian style, where I'm kind of try to problematize a bit there, but thinking about just motifs that aren't really discussed very far, and people get to choose those, kind of that to identify themselves with specific communities as either local to Uruk or a wider Seleukid identity, possibly.
You mean like a local symbol as opposed to a Seleukid symbol?
Right, exactly, or even just a longer standing symbol. So I'm going to look specifically at hybrid creatures, griffins and sphinxes that have been around forever, but also changed a lot over time, and why people might use them and things like that. So, because very rarely do we have symbols. Yeah. Go on, sorry.
I think that'll be a brilliant and useful contribution. Absolutely. I think that something like that is exactly the sort of thing that could help fill in that kind of granularity of detail that we're missing, right?
Thank you. I appreciate that. Kind of formulating it right now with my advisor, so it's good to hear.
Richard, I said that I don't think coins work, but actually there's a question in Oliver Hoover's disappeared of the uses of sort of long-standing, particularly Alexander coinage in the Seleucid Empire, which does circulate. I don't know if it's resistance or just instrumental in use of that, and its appearance on it's sort of hard to. I don't want to say acceptance of coinage is either acceptance of Seleucid authority or resistance to Seleucid authority. I don't think it matters that much on a transactional basis.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would have suggested, right? I mean, coins are purely, well, I won't say purely, but largely instrumental in their nature, right? I mean, it's the precious metal value and weight of the coin ultimately that I think is more important than the image that's stamped on it. We see countermarked coins all the time. I have no doubt that coins were probably melted down and reminted. You know, it's their exchange value as a store of value that I think most people, and one has to wonder, you know, how what the sort of average schmuck in the street thought when he had a coin in his hand and he looked at an image, right? It's doubtful that he was able to read the legend, and did the image even mean anything to him, right?
I know, but if you're in the
interesting article. Go on, sorry.
No, but if you're in the middle of the Fifth Syrian War and the Seleucids are coming through, and you're a city and you're still minting Ptolemaic coins, you're making statements, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. I think also there's been a really interesting analysis done of like smaller bronze coins that might be used every day versus like larger silver coins that elites might use, and the imagery being very different on those, and the types of messages that get sent is very purposeful in that way. So in theory, at least the Seleucids and local elites thought that every person could understand the imagery to a certain extent.
Picking up on what we just said, I want to add two anecdotal things that meet part of what Rachel is just talking about. I keep reading that at the time of the American Revolution, only about a quarter of the colonists angrily wanted to rebel from King George, maybe a third. And an equal faction were loyal to King George and signed up as loyalists and fought back. And the middle, biggest portion, was neutral and didn't really care which way it went. And they were politically uninvolved, and they completely refused to get themselves. But once the war was over and there was a new country, they stayed. Okay, and I think this will happen often in fighting back and forth between the Ptolemaic and Seleukid dynasties over Qualis area and maybe other places in the islands and such, that a lot of people simply don't care. And if you look at American presidential elections, unlike most other countries, voter apathy is enormous. A lot of people think it makes no difference who wins the election in their lives, and they don't vote. And recently we've gotten voter turnout up to 58, 59%, which is the highest we've had in about 40 years. And most people vote, but only by a slim most. And it went down to about 50.1, 50.5% at the low point, which meant half the country thought it makes no difference who's in charge. They didn't bother to vote. And I know this is not the case in Western European democracies, and I expect not in Canada. where voting turnout is always higher than 55%. But in the US, politicians and strategists are really excited when the voting turnout is over 55%. It means they got out their message and they made people think it was an emergency and it was desperate. It doesn't happen too often in my lifetime. So I think a lot of people just don't care. And it's impossible for us, not that it is impossible for us to see what the average person on the street of Caesarea, I chose the wrong city, Caesarea is obviously too late, in the Tyre or Sidon, in the back and forth struggle between Ptolemies and Seleucids, the average person on the street thinks it makes no difference, and we can tell. That's what I would propose to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is why, again, you see a lack of interest in defending one royal authority versus another royal authority.
Why should I risk my
that? Pardon?
Why should they connect something that makes to them no difference?
Well, exactly, because they'll either be paying their tribute to one king or to another king, and swap them out, mix and match. It really doesn't matter. The condition of the average laos, right, it doesn't change. Right?
I remember Ben making an excellent point when we were in Canada all together. I think we were up at your place, Richard, when Altay. I think you and Altay were discussing whether there was a pro-Seleukid or a pro-Ptolemaic faction. And Ben asserted there was actually a third group entirely, and that third group entirely was throw the rascals out. I don't want either of them. But had to be subtle about how they expressed themselves because they had to wait until the other two had worn each other down before they would have an opportunity to rebel.
Right, but you'll have, like in the Fifth Syrian War, which I keep coming back to, you'll have a Gaza that will stand up to Antiochus, and he has to have a great big siege, and they are Ptolemaic loyalists. So for every, that's the thing. For every example you can give on one side, that's what Altay was doing. You can give examples on the other side. But Richard, I have another question. Are we the first Seleucidists? That is, in the Seleucid Empire, were there people who were patriotic Seleucidists? Or are we the first ones?
Yeah, I think that the idea of a patriotic Seleukidist is a non-starter. I think the Seleukid name was only meaningful to the Seleukid members of the Seleukid dynasty, to the family, right? I mean, I actually picture an entity that this is what fascinates me about it, really. An entity that is, almost like just a private entity, private property owners that own property across a vast expanse of territory, and they are able to leverage the wealth of that property to variously bribe or else threaten other local polities into participating in whatever project it is they happen to have going on at the time. And through that kind of horse trading between this private family and other locally legitimately constituted polities, they are able to maintain power, right, by playing one off against the other, right?
Like a giant real estate holding corporation.
Kind of, yeah. And I mean, you even mentioned Gaza, right? I mean, obviously you're going to find loci of resistance and so on, but this is really just begs the question, right? We need to know what specifically is happening in Gaza, who's in Gaza at that time, in the case of the Fifth Syrian War, for example. If there is a substantial Ptolemaic garrison already in there, then I would expect there to be some kind of resistance, right? But if such garrison is lacking, or maybe it's just thin in terms of numbers, then the dynamic might be very, very different, and the people might actually then similarly open their gates rather than actually resist.
Okay, so like let's use a Phoenician city like Ice was bringing up. So I'm in Tyre, right? The center of my world is Tyre, right? Okay, that's what I care about. I have a long history going all the way back. Nobody's been able to conquer me, right? And that's the center of my world. You have autochthony, these myths coming up of, we're the center of the world. This is where the first human beings were. The gods, bless us. We have our own gods. We have our own things. Why would I want the Seleukid over me, right? Who are these guys, right? And it's exactly what you say. If I have to if I have to have them over me, all right, and they'll protect me from some other guys, but I never want them because my world is the Tyre is the center of my world. I want a free and independent and autonomous Tyre.
Right, ideally, right? And if that option is not available, well, then you have to deal with the circumstances as they are.
Until you can break free.
Until you can break free, exactly. So.
Are there more groups than that? So let's take Tyre. So you've got that group. You've got another group who the Seleucids have come in, and traditionally in Tyre, other people run the town. I'd really like to be in charge. The Seleucids have come in, and because the Seleucids are in, they like me over these other people, and therefore I want the Seleucids around because I get more power in the world that I care about.
That's the word elite I was trying to bring up. Right. I am part of that pro-Seleukid elite because it's better for me.
Yeah. And then there's the other group that there's a third group over here that might come in occasionally. And if they're ever around, I'm going to go support them. And then there's a fourth group that says, we never had power with any of these at all.
Right.
And I just wish they'd go away, but I don't care who's in charge, just leave me alone.
But you're laughing, but that's a good model.
Yeah. But that's exactly right. And it just suggests that the relations, as I said already, are instrumental, right? What the one thing that's lacking in any of this is some kind of, I forget who mentioned it now, but a kind of heartfelt, I think it was Ben, a heartfelt sort of Seleukid patriotism, right? This kind of idea that the Seleukid kings have some kind of natural and organic right to rule here, right? As opposed to simply a resource to be leveraged in some way.
But what about Altay's examples of these kings who could, on a moment's notice, raise up a whole army? There were people who responded, right? The thing is, we need a spectrum, right? Now, you have given us a very wonderful and necessary corrective, right, on one side of the spectrum, but there's a whole spectrum, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that is good. We are reaching kind of a conclusion for today's talk and tasks, chores for future research. And I think that Ben will be thrilled to hear that I really recommend Judean Maccabean history in the 2nd century because it illustrates as better than any other 2nd century local history or local perspective how you may have these divided societies, these divided elites, where some of them try to stay in power or gain power with the support of the Seleucids, and others do it with the support of the Ptolemies, yet others try to do it with the support of the Romans, yet others think God alone is enough to bring them complete independence, and so on. We have no better sources, and I have one chapter forthcoming in which I show how nearly every single expression of loyalty to the Seleucids coming from Judea is very closely bound back to legitimate oneself. So mainly most of what we have is, of course, Maccabean, and but there is then a huge diversity of these kinds of expressions, and they are really worth looking at in much detail. And they even go so far to express a very deep friendship to Alexander Balas, between Jonathan and Alexander Balas, even in high after the death. Well, no big surprise, because the Jews were able to expand their Judean territory and even gain strength within Seleukid Syria to a degree that they had never ruled or co-ruled before, and they would never rule before.
What you're calling friendship, what you're calling friendship or deep friendship, I would call an alliance where our agendas are parallel.
But I call it friendship because that's the terminology used.
I understand, but friendship really is alliance, right?
There is a big overlap, but there is more to it in ancient diplomatic terminology. The notion of friendship in diplomacy is very wide-ranging, and I think there is a lot of scholarship to really bolster the view that there is more to it than only something formal. By using the terms of friendship and also rituals of establishing or maintaining, refreshing, renewing friendship, real friendship was in a certain way construed. And something that would go beyond alliances that are only instrumental. So if you think of an alliance as something a coming together that is instrumental, that's defined by a common goal, but then loses its purpose after the goal is achieved, friendship has at least the claim to go much deeper, to have this personal side, and to go beyond the immediate benefit. Some of it is then, of course, kind of propaganda or ideology and may not really have gone deep. We may wonder about many friendships with the Romans, especially when the Romans treated their friends in a very, very poor and
when did that ever happen?
Negative way.
I do want to push back, Ben, on this idea that there isn't a group of people who might be loyal to the king.
No, I was asking Richard. I think there might be two.
And you see it in the modern world. You see it with Trump. You see it with Ataturk. You see it with people who move beyond that transactional relationship in which you see it in Britain with loyalty to the Queen in ways I don't really understand.
Or actually other members of the royal family, which is even harder to understand.
Yes. Yeah. And Kyle, to back you up, remember, we're talking about a world where gods and human beings were in, some kind of continuum, right? And where, charisma is a word that we don't really understand the way they felt it.
Yeah, I mean, there can be no question that, and as I sort of ended my discussion, I made reference to that there are no doubt examples of loyalty, true loyalty, like a deeper loyalty to Seleukid kings. The problem is, of course, it's difficult for us to tease out from the sources, such as they are, what's motivating that, right? Again, from my point of view, they seem to be by and large instrumental. Maybe that's an overly cynical reading, but I think that the fact that, as I said, revolt, betraying Seleukid royal authority and so on is so common, right? Erstwhile loyal supporters can turn on a dime when the circumstances favor their doing so, right? Suggests to me that these loyalties didn't run especially deep at all, right? But having said that, there's no denying the possibility that in the same way that Trump has his diehard supporters who I think really believe that whatever the election was stolen and that Democrats eat babies.
They would die hard for him. Right.
Pardon me?
They would die hard for him. You're right.
Well, and the events on January 6th, I think, demonstrated that, right?
Absolutely.
So clearly there were people who supported him. The challenge, of course, is separating all of those out in the sources, right? And I don't see a way to do that. right?
Well, the Trump example is very helpful also because it illustrates how many politicians are just so dishonest and have changed their minds about Trump completely in a very opportunistic way, just because they think that he still holds so much power and influence that it's dangerous to turn against him. So I don't need to name politicians, but if we look back over the last, say, 5 years, we see remarkable stories of well, switches from denigration to praise, back to denigration, and that is well, we need to our eyes need to be open for seeing these people that are more the kind of people that Richard has in mind, people guided by fear or opportunistic interests, and other people that are really convinced and truly given to him, whether for blindness, whether for a larger overlap of worldviews or long-term interests or whatsoever. So I think it's quite helpful to look at this kind of loyalties to also understand the diversity of loyalty relations in the Seleukid and other Hellenistic.
But a lot of those same Republican spineless people, right, if Trump was out of the picture, would turn on him on a dime.
Or if
right?
it was found, once he'd been convicted of something. Absolutely.
Right, right. Mark Rubio will say, "Oh, I really never really believed in him." I mean, these guys are so spineless and so cynical, and it's just interest.
It raises, in the Seleukid context, certainly it raises a long-standing methodological problem in historiography more generally, which is, getting to what the author of our sources or of any piece of ancient writing actually thought when they were writing something, right? Are the opinions on the page that survives that we have in front of us, are those views necessarily the views of the author? The whole problem of the satiric mask and so on, for example, if we're talking about satire, right? People write in a particular context. To choose a Byzantine example, you've got Procopius's history, and then you have his secret history, right?
Yeah.
We benefit from having these two documents, which we can compare, but in many instances,
we don't.
We don't, right? Tacitus talks about how, in the age of Domitian, people could not speak their mind, right? Historians certainly could not freely write or express their opinions such as they were, and how in his own day there is now a breath of fresh air that has allowed people to speak honestly and clearly. Well, doesn't the first part of what he said really undermine the second part of what he goes on to say? How do we know that this is not what's happening in the case of Tacitus's own day, right? Writing post Domitian, right? We can't, right? We can't ever really know that, and so trying to separate out, as I said, the motivations of the various contending parties, whether they're instrumental, whether they're diehard loyalists, becomes a very thorny historiographical problem. My view on this, and the point that I'm trying to make here, is simply that it doesn't entitle us to say one way or the other whether these attempts at generating local consensus and loyalty were particularly effective. The sources just don't allow us to any kind of clarity on that particular question. We can try to read the tea leaves. We can try to divine what's happening by based on local reactions to in this case the exercise of Seleukid power in local contexts, but it'll only ever be an exercise in interpretation, right? In trying to tease out what those reactions actually mean.
But in the end, we have to be open, right, to all these possibilities.
Absolutely.
And your kind of paper makes us more open. So that's really a real service.
Well, that is really a very neat conclusion to a very stimulating discussion we've had. Thanks to Richard in the first place and Kyle in the second place. So I'm truly grateful for your contributions and enjoyed our coming together, our learning together very much. So a nice next step on our well, collaborative work to elucidate Seleukid history and world history with this. So this is a good point for me to end the recording and thank all of you very much again. I look forward to seeing you soon again.
Very good. Thank you, everybody.
It was wonderful. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Take care.
Thanks all.
Cheers.
You know, that was 2.5 hours.
Wow. Oh, that's great.
Isn't that great?
Very enjoyable.
That was
All right.
And just for the record, I stopped